If you want, we can.
Okay. I mean, what do you think? Yes or no?
I think we should just do it.
Take that.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and being a part of our ongoing community activities. We're always believers in the importance of bringing people together to talk about important topics and to have a good discussion. So, as always, this will be as effective as you help make it, which is if you're involved and engaged and asking questions, then we'll have a good dialogue. And I cannot think of a more important topic to be discussing around artificial intelligence than the underlying beliefs and ethics that we want as society, as humanity. And so I think this topic is both critical but also timely, because AI is a runaway train at the moment. Everybody's excited. There's a lot of startups, money flowing everywhere, big companies and entrepreneurs and governments all thinking about it. You would have seen, of course, the recent announcement by Singapore government of another big chunk of investments going into AI, and a lot of people thinking about it. So we're lucky today to have Kathy Baxter from Salesforce with us. For those that have been involved in any other events, Richard Socher, who's chief scientist for Salesforce, has also spent some time with us, and we've had the benefit of some of Richard's thinking, and so it's very exciting to now have Kathy, who works closely with Richard, to think through these issues not only on behalf of Salesforce, but on behalf of many companies. And Kathy has deep experience, and not only educational experience, but practical experience in how these issues should be considered. So first, we'll have Kathy share perspectives and thoughts, and then please be thinking about it. I'd love for you to make my job as moderator ever so easy, which is I've got a couple of questions on my mind, but most importantly, what's on your mind. And so we'll get to that section as soon as we've had a chance to listen and learn from Kathy. So Kathy, you'll self-introduce. I always like to have someone introduce in whatever way they'd prefer. And so I'm going to ask you to join the stage. And please help me welcome Kathy Baxter. And what I'm going to do is our always traditional but always critical group photos so that we can share on social media and say we were here today to talk about these things. So I'm going to ask my teammate, Tuan, to help me take a pic. And so, forgive me, but can everybody jump up? And what we'll do is Kathy and I will be here, and then everybody just smile, wave, whatever you feel compelled to do, and then we'll get into it. Okay. All right. Tuan, you want to give us the 1, 2, 3?
Very much. Are you able to hear me? Do I need the microphone? All good? All right, let's do that. Give myself a free hand. I gesticulate a lot. There we go. All right. So I am currently at Salesforce. I am architect of ethical AI practice. My background is in psychology and human factors engineering. I've been in the tech industry for over 20 years now, doing the Silicon Valley tour, Oracle, eBay, Google, and now Salesforce. So have a lot of experience thinking about how do we think about the ethics of what we build, the ethics of what we contribute back into society. And so this role really formalizes that experience into one. Okay. Hear me? All right. All good? All right. So I want to start off with some good news. A survey by Capgemini found that people who perceive AI to be ethical are more likely to report that they trust that company. They're more likely to share their positive experiences with friends and family, have higher loyalty, they'll purchase more products. So this is a good thing. Perceived ethics is good for business as well as for society. But unfortunately, we're still seeing headlines of lots of harmful AI. These are headlines just from the last couple of months. So how is this happening? How, even though we know that ethical AI is trusted AI, does this keep happening? Well, in a study that was done by GLG in November found that over 70% of the companies, of the executives at companies that they surveyed in financial services, healthcare, and consulting say that they have adopted AI in the last 3 years. But 74% of them have not put measures in place to manage AI bias. Only 31%, or an additional 31%, have not established ethical AI practices at all. Only 16% have a dedicated committee in their organizations to oversee AI use, and only 13% say that they will identify intelligent agents or chatbots as non-human entities. That means that the vast majority are using chatbots or intelligent AI and trying to convince their consumers and users that they're actually humans. Not cool. So when we talk about an ethical AI practice, what do we mean by that? At Salesforce, these are our principles. This is what we believe. We believe that AI should be responsible. It needs to safeguard human rights and protect the data that we are entrusted with. It needs to be accountable. We constantly seek external feedback and for continuous improvement. We work with groups like PAI, WEF. We have an ethical use advisory council that has experts from academia and civil society that participate in our reviews. We believe it must be transparent. So transparent in how we work, how we develop our AI, as well as having explainable and interpretable user experiences. We believe it needs to be empowering. This isn't about simply replacing humans. There are places where it is good to have AI replace humans, such as in the dangers, the dirty, the drudgery. Those are good things. But for the vast majority of use cases, this should be about augmenting and helping humans do things better. We want to empower people. And then finally, inclusive. We believe in respecting the societal values of everyone that our products touch. It is not AI itself. It is not the technology itself that's good or bad. It's how people use it that really matters. So there are a few terms that you might be familiar with that you might hear bandied around when we talk about ethical or responsible or trusted AI, terms like bias, fairness, equality, and equity. I thought I would just touch on some of those so we're all kind of using the same terms and we know what we're referring to. So first and foremost, when we talk about bias in AI, we have to talk about it in terms of statistics and probability because that's what AI is based on. So when we talk about bias, we mean error. We mean deviation from ground truth. There are many places that that error or that bias can enter the system, but at the end of the day, it is error. So what are those sources? Here are just 5. And I want to give a shout out. It's down here in the corner. You might not be able to see it. Suresh and Gutag, bless you, 2019. If you want to look up their paper, this is a fantastic image that I like to share. So to begin with, historical or societal bias is the bias that enters during the data generation process. This comes as a result of just how we humans interact with each other and make decisions. Representation bias comes in when we decide who is it that we are going to include in our data collection and analysis. Are there some groups that we are going to exclude? Are there some groups that are going to be overrepresented? Once we have that population, then we have the case of measurement bias. How do we go about measuring what matters? You've probably heard the phrase, what you measure is what matters. So what are those metrics? How are you making those evaluations, collecting that data? We take that data, we divide it in half between a training set and an evaluation set. When we come in, we're creating our model, and then we go through an evaluation in this constant loop of optimization and evaluation, and we can have evaluation bias. How are we evaluating that model? How are we defining what it means to be accurate? How are we evaluating the performance? How do we evaluate what we mean by fair? There are 21 different definitions of fairness out there in the world. Which one do you pick? How do you identify if there is bias in the system? And then aggregation bias. This is based on fundamental assumptions that we make about the population that is going to be impacted by this system. How are we going to apply this model in our decision-making processes? Are you understanding how there are some people that might actually be hurt by this system? Do you go and change the model or how you're applying it based on how it's impacting others? So biased algorithms can be easier to fix than biased humans. We as humans all have some amount of unconscious bias, and that's really hard to address because we're not conscious of it. We're not aware of it. If you're not aware of it, it makes it hard to address. Then, of course, there is the conscious bias. If you are aware that you have bias against something, someone, you may be reluctant to do anything about it. But when it comes to AI, with the ability of having model interpretability, understanding what is the model doing, being able to highlight that in this loan application, you are more likely to give loans to men than women, or you give a higher credit rating to one group versus another. It can highlight these things, and then you can find ways to be able to address it. Of course, the exception that we have to call out are the deep neural networks. These tend to be black boxes. It's very difficult to have model interpretability and explainability in these cases. But we can intentionally design models to be less biased than humans. I don't want to say unbiased because that's an extremely high bar to be able to meet, and it's hard to be able to say that there is no one that might be harmed, that there is no error that is going to result in the predictions or recommendations. I love this quote by Leonard. He says, AI models hold a mirror up to us. They don't understand when we really don't want honesty. They'll only tell us polite fictions if we tell them how to lie to us ahead of time. We know what we want the models to do. We know what we want to see. AI can be a form of money laundering for bias. We can hide our own biases in these systems. We can trick ourselves into believing that the magic of AI sweeps away the human biases and it gives us more objective decision making, when in actuality, it may be magnifying the existing biases. So let's move on to fairness, equality, and equity. These are all related to each other. So when we talk about fairness, it's usually defined as a decision made free of self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. Equality is defined as everyone is treated identically. Sometimes this is known as group fairness. And equity means similar groups are treated similarly. It can also be defined as individual fairness. So I like to use this image to define the difference between equality and equity. So on your left-hand side, we have Cody, Astro, and Einstein, and they're at the lookout point, and they all have equal access. They can all get to this lookout point. But Astro and Einstein can't see the waterfall. They can't see this beautiful view. This is equality. This is about equal access. But equity means that we're providing a little something extra for Astro and Einstein. We give them a few extra rocks. Now they can see the beautiful view that Cody can, and it doesn't take anything away from Cody. So when we talk about fairness, we have to think about fairness from what point of view? Does anybody have to, like, who benefits and who pays? So next I'm going to move into a few high-risk AI applications. This is by no means exhaustive. I've spent the last few weeks working on this, trying to hone it down to something that fits within this time frame. But this will at least give you a flavor of 5 different applications that tend to be high risk in the use or implementation of them. So I define high-risk applications as those that will or have the potential to directly or indirectly violate human rights, be used for surveillance purposes, enable customers in a regulated industry to violate those regulations, mislead customers about the origin of content or disseminate disinformation, make criminal justice or entitlement recommendations, and recognize, analyze, or predict emotions. So that's a lot. I'm going to go into, again, 5 different examples that meet these criteria. Facial recognition, emotion recognition and prediction, hiring AI, healthcare recommendations and predictions, and then synthetic content and deep fakes. See, people are taking pictures, so I'm going to pause for a second. All right. So let's move into facial recognition. How many people here are familiar with Joy Belawame and the gender shades study? See a few hands. If you get a chance, go to YouTube, type in AI, Ain't I a Woman? Amazing, amazing. Every time I watch it, I still get goosebumps. Joy Belawame is a researcher at MIT, and she did this analysis. It's the first really big study of facial recognition and its accuracy. And she found that AI, the facial recognition technologies that are on the market today are really lousy for people with darker skin tones and really lousy for women. But if you are a woman of color, you get this intersectionality of bias where these two overlap each other and are much, much worse. When the technology is worse for a subset of the population, then bad things are going to happen for that subset of the population. And this is not a small subset. These are people with darker skin tones, and these are women. That's a pretty big group. So, in other words, facial recognition technology is pretty darn good if you're a middle-aged white dude. If you're everybody else, not so much. Increasingly, FRT is being used in law enforcement, airports, public housing units in the US, and all kinds of public spaces. Singapore, specifically, facial recognition technology is being used in hotels, airports, banks, and the lampposts as part of the lamppost project, and to find lost elderly individuals. Just last December, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, in the US, did an analysis and released the results analyzing current facial recognition technologies that are on the marketplace today, all of them that are out there today, and found that it can misidentify members of some groups up to 100 times more frequently than others. That is banana pants. That is not acceptable. What technology would we be releasing in a public space that impacts your rights, that impacts your access, that can be 100 times inaccurate for some groups? That should outrage you. That should infuriate you. And so this is a global issue. Although these studies are being done in the US, this is a global issue because false positive identification can result in the violation of one's human rights. 3 US states have banned the use of facial recognition technology in body cams, and there are major US cities like San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, that have banned it entirely. Because this isn't right, because this isn't safe, because this isn't accurate, these states and cities have stepped up and said, not right now. Get your act together and we can reconsider. So societal with this technology varies based on trust in government and the private industries that use it. So there is significant pushback in the US because, unfortunately, we're a very bifurcated society right now, and there isn't a lot of trust in government institutions and therefore their use of this technology. All right, emotion recognition and prediction. So detecting emotion is all the rage right now. There are a ton of different applications for this out there. Every time I open up a story, there seems to be some new application of it. So TSA in the US, but additional airports have been using it for a few years now to attempt to identify when passengers are being deceitful. There's something that they're trying to hide, and potentially identify terrorists. They found in that the TSA that their applications were not accurate. They were making predictions that were no better than chance, and so they've been pulling back on that use. It's being used in hiring in US and South Korea, and I have a section on that in just a couple of slides, so I'll tell you more about. It's being used in classrooms in China to detect when children are confused or they're being inattentive. Game developers, advertisers, movie studios are all using it to measure consumer engagement with their content. You know, where are the peak high emotions? Where are the places that they feel strong emotions? And there are a number of different researchers that have been using it for a whole range of things, like trying to identify duality. Identify when someone is depressed. I'm not talking about sad, but like clinical depression. As well as to help people with autism be able to identify the emotions of the person that they're interacting with so that they can improve that social engagement. Some of these uses are more benign than others. Some of them help people with autism be able to engage better with others. But you could imagine, without much stretch of the imagination, really harmful or abusive. So emotion detection, despite what some of the research studies are, it's inaccurate, and it's so easily abused. In voice analysis and recognition, emotion prosody and non-linguistic sounds vary by race, region, and culture, making it extremely difficult to be accurate. For those of you who are not linguists, emotional prosody, that is within your voice, being able to express emotion through one's pitch, timbre, speech, pauses in the speech, all of those types of things. These vary greatly by, again, race, region, and culture. So trying to come up with something that's accurate across a broad range of society, very, very difficult. In image and video analysis, it suffers from all the same biases as facial recognition because it uses that as the base technology, plus the added bias of cultural. Much more aggressive, like myself. Random, candid photos of myself never look good. Every time I see somebody post a picture of me on Twitter, I kind of bizarre, contorted face. People in other cultures tend to be much more subdued in their expressions. But then emotional expressions vary within the same individual, depending on the context, depending on the appropriateness. How I'd respond can something varies so dramatically within a single individual, you can imagine how much it also varies across an entire group. And despite much of the research that the creators of this technology would like you to believe, their research studies often cannot be replicated. And there are fundamental methodological issues with those studies. So for anyone to claim that this is a solved problem, believe it. All right, hiring AI. There are two primary types of hiring AI. The first is resume and application screening, and the second is video-based interviewing AI. So with resume and application screening, they make predictions on who is a good candidate to bring in based on complex correlations from previous candidates that have been hired in that company, as well as previous individuals that have been promoted, that have been highlighted as being particularly successful. So in one particular hiring AI tool, they found that the top 2 predictors of a successful candidate is someone with the name Jared, and they played lacrosse in high school. That is ridiculous. But it just highlighted how incredibly biased their historical hiring and promotion practices were. After 3 years, Amazon was unable to remove the gender bias in their AI hiring tool, and they had to abandon it. They tried stripping out gender from the resumes and the applications. They tried removing the word woman or women's from the resume, for example, women's soccer team or women's club. They tried to do a number of different things with the model itself. No matter what they did, they weren't able to reduce it because, again, the historical bias was so significant. AI just couldn't fix it. For video-based interviewing, I've got 3 different headlines here, and I was so excited when I saw that at 12:30 this afternoon, the Straits Times had this article, "Smile with Your Eyes, How to Beat South Korea's AI Hiring Bots and Land a Job." So there are they're called cramming schools in South Korea, where people are trying to figure out how to beat a system, beat a test, and get hired. So now they have courses on how to beat an AI hiring bot. And one of the recommendations is don't force a smile with your mouth, smile with your eyes. I don't know, how do you smile with your eyes? I'm not even sure. In Singapore, DBS Bank has been using AI to hire candidates. And in the US, there are, HireVue is probably the most well-known face scanning app. And so in these particular cases, a candidate is being interviewed, and the AI is analyzing for facial expressions. And they are of word choice, trying to figure out the grade level of the person's vocabulary, their engagement. And they give a score like employability. One even claims that they can measure someone. And again, all of these things, they have the same bias as what you would find in a facial application, with all of the additional biases on top of it. So the US state of Illinois is actually the use of hiring AI. A company must notify the individuals if an AI is being used to screen the resumes or the applications, and they have to be transparent used. All right, healthcare recommendations and predictions. So there is potential AI to do tremendous things in the healthcare arena. So being able to detect tumors that the human eye misses, or identify new drugs and treatments that we hadn't found before. But because there are these different issues of societal bias, gender differences, and how information is collected or how the studies are done, there's a huge risk of inaccuracies in those health recommendations and predictions. So just within the US, there is tremendous societal value in patient treatment. To give you just a few examples, one study found that the length of hospital stays vary by US postal code. So if you are in a poor area, your hospital stay is going to be very brief. As soon as they can physically get you out of that hospital, they're going to get you out. You're not going to have very good outcomes. As opposed to if you're in a more affluent area, you're probably going to have a longer hospital stay, and that's going to allow you to have more time to recover, and you're going to have better physical outcomes. There have been numerous studies finding biased language in doctors' notes. So for example, using the word alcohol abuse when it's a minority patient versus alcohol dependence when it's a more affluent patient. It might not seem like those two words are dramatically different, but they are. They're handled differently when there is NLP being used to analyze the data. People without health insurance in the US are very unlikely to receive preventative care or to receive certain treatments or tests. All of this means that there is a lack of data representativeness when we are doing this analysis. And so healthcare AI is going to be more likely to be accurate for those who are more affluent and who are white or non-minorities. But there are also genetic differences that affect everyone. So for example, skin care in people with especially dark skin is rarer, but when it is present, it manifests differently, and it tends to be much more aggressive. So if you take a look at what used to be the old school training data for dermatologists, textbooks, slides of images, you will see that the vast majority of those images are of skincare on white individuals. Doctors themselves haven't been trained to recognize skincare in people with very dark skin. Women in sub-Saharan Africa develop breast cancer at dramatically younger ages than women in developed nations. And so when you're trying to train an AI and you're using mammogram data or breast visualization, the breast tissue looks different for a 20-year-old than it does for a 40 or 50-year-old. So again, it's not going to. Women experience different symptoms for heart attacks than men. So if you're trying to predict heart attack data or predict if someone is having a heart attack, it's going to look different by gender. So on a bright note, Singapore just created the largest genetic database of Asian populations. And so that is one step towards collecting more representative data to be used in these systems. And again, there are other factors that influence an AI prediction. So for example, those predictions are going to look different based on the brand of MRI machine or X-ray, the time a blood test was taken. The accuracy or completeness of an electronic health record obviously is going to influence the accuracy of an AI prediction. And then finally, whether or not a patient was visited by a chaplain. Kind of crazy, but the study found that that will have an influence on the data collected and therefore the prediction. So healthcare AI benefits are simply not available to all. When you combine societal bias with genetic differences, you end up again with this intersectionality of bias. So if the training is not representative, the recommendations and predictions won't be either. Again, I mentioned a moment ago about mammograms or AI analysis of mammograms being less accurate for women in sub-Saharan Africa. And a huge story 2 months ago was that a medical AI system failed to correctly identify Black patients as needing extra care. Black patients were consistently being released from a hospital as being fine, as not needing the additional care because the data were not representative. So here's a quote from Joy Belawame, again, the woman who founded the Algorithmic Justice League and did the Gender Shade Study. When these systems fail, they fail the people who are already marginalized, the people who are already vulnerable. That should be very powerful. The people who could probably benefit most from AI technology are the ones that are being hurt the most. All right, final one, almost done here. Synthetic content or deep fakes. So I like to say synthetic content is how to make friends and influence people, sometimes in really horrible ways. It can be used for some good purposes, like creating training data sets for very rare or hard to measure events. It can be used for somewhat benign purposes, like customer service bots that pretend to be human for better customer experience. I would argue that it is in no way better if you think you're interacting with a human when you're really not. But then we see really horrible things, like the deepfake porn. So somebody putting somebody's face on another person's body. It can be used to humiliate them or extort money from them. We also get videos of people saying and doing things that they didn't, either for satire or to sway public opinion. So you may or may not be familiar with this video of showing Obama saying things that he really didn't. This was probably the first really well-known deepfake video that most people became familiar with. And of course, voice impersonation in order to break security systems. So deepfakes are a true risk to democracy, society, our justice system. There is a race right now to build AI that can detect deepfakes. So it's this nuclear arms race, basically, with those creating it to be able to find ways to identify it. Singapore's Black Dot Research was founded to fact-check, actually, stories in social media. California has identified this as such a risk that there are 3 different laws that have actually been implemented in 2019. The first one is distribution of audio or video that gives a false, damaging impression of a politician's words or actions within 60 days of an election. So here is an example. On the left-hand side, we have Alec Baldwin doing one of his brilliant impressions of Trump. And then on the right, we have a deepfake version of that same satire that was done on Saturday Night Live with Trump's face put on top of it. And a deepfake detector identified Alec Baldwin as being the real Donald Trump, and the deepfake, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so Donald Trump's face, who was the real face, and Alec Baldwin as being the real person. Non-consensual deepfake pornography has been banned, and use of a bot to communicate or interact with another person in California online with the intent to mislead the other person about its artificial identity. So we actually have something similar to this line in Salesforce's acceptable use policy. For our chatbots product, you are not allowed to use it without communicating that it is a bot. You can't pretend that our chatbot is actually a human. Ultimately, deepfakes are simply amplifying what I call the liar's dividend. When nothing is true, then the dishonest person will thrive by saying what's true is fake. So, some recommendations. As you are thinking about AI to either create or implement, you should truly ask, will this AI benefit society as a whole, just part of it, or just your company? You need to include stakeholders from all segments of society in ethical reviews. You need to really understand, how is this going to impact everyone, not just the people that you want or think might be impacted by it. You need to ensure that your training data are representative of all of society. Bring in experts from civil society or academia for testing and accountability. Use interpretable models. Particularly for high-risk applications, you should not be using black boxes. This is the place where deep learning is perhaps the most powerful, but it is also the place where it is the most risky. And then finally, be transparent and give users control over what's collected about them, how it's used, and the ability to opt out. GDPR is a great thing in this area. California has now implemented the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, which is very similar in that regard, but many other areas don't have similar legal obligations. So it would be great if everyone did this voluntarily. All right. Much.
questions, some areas that you'd like to discuss. First of all, thank you, Kathy. I should have said thank you at the beginning. What I'd like to do is just kind of jump in and see where this thing leads us. I would also like, thank you, would also like to make sure, I'll see if I can get a microphone. Would like to make sure that if you've got something that you'd like to discuss, the one thing that I would ask in order to try and be fair to everyone is that you ask your question and then we allow Kathy to respond. Sometimes there's a desire for someone to sort of give a 10-minute intro to their question. So in order to be fair to everyone, please, if we could. What I'd like to do, and I took the liberty of grabbing one of your slides that I'll put up here in a moment, not yet, but there were some numbers on there that I'd like to refer to, and I just wanted to use them as a memory aid. But let me just jump in here a little bit. I'll start with a question that I did not intend to ask because I just hadn't thought deeply about it until you mentioned it. GDPR.
Yes.
As you travel around and as you work with different corporations and different government leaders, do you see that there is a way for society, and I'll say sort of, capital S, to harmonize around a relatively shared set of values with regard to data? Or do we fall back to the inevitable, it's cultural, and we think of data in this market and that market being quite differently thought of in a different market? How close do you think we can get to a shared set of perspectives on data and use of data?
Yeah, so I think there have been a couple of reports that have done a really good job of pulling together the plethora of AI ethical principles that are out there. Most companies have created their own. We certainly have. Countries now are developing their own as well. And there's tremendous overlap. When you look at all of these different principles, there's just an incredible overlap in them, which is a great thing. I think with China's AI principles, there are slight differences there, and it highlights, for me, the difference between an individualistic culture and a collectivist culture. It can be hard to disentangle that collectivist culture from a more strict regime that wants to have control over their population. So I do think we have to remember different values. But when it comes to something like protecting one's data, giving one transparency and control over what's being collected and how that information is used, I would like to believe that that is a consistent metric that society would like to have. Whether or not all companies would like that is a completely different issue, but when we're thinking of individuals and how information about them is being used for or against them, that I think is more of a universal need and appreciation.
One of the things that I think about is, especially when we take a look at blockchain, just to use the example, how can you unlearn or forget something? So the debate about if I use this set of data from this group in order to train a model, and then later so-and-so says, I would like to remove my consent. How do we, and not so much asking you to solve it, but is that discussion occurring in a very tangible and practical way, how to strike this balance between more data ought to mean a more intelligent and more accurate set of models, but yet we give people more rights to later remove consent? Is that discussion occurring, and are there tangible paths forward that are being identified?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, the concerns were definitely raised by companies to say, whoa, this is too hard. If we have to go and delete somebody's data, then that means that we got to go back and retrain the model. Okay. There are a lot of models that are trained frequently. There's a refresh as new data are coming in. And so it's not something that I think is insurmountable. Companies may not like to do it, but it is possible to do. And then I think we need to find a way then to be able to analyze how those people removing their data, how it changes the model. Do we end up with some kind of self-selection bias that there is a subset of the population that always wants their data or is consistently asking for their data to be removed, and it's moving the model in a harmful way? So how do we track that without, again, violating the person's privacy? So that is something that is not solved yet. Is there a way through blockchain or some other irrefutable ledger that we can keep some type of metadata to understand the impact of the removal, but without violating that person's desire?
Yeah, the challenge with me moderating some things like this is whenever I'm speaking with somebody, I'm always intrigued and think, what about? So I want to pick up on that point, your zip code example, and then I want to link that to this sort of anti-vax conspiracy theories, which is, you get these messages that say vaccines are bad, and suddenly groups of parents in certain communities pick up on that message. So to your point about unintentionally taking what could have been a more accurate model and making it less accurate if too many people within a demographic say, I don't want government or someone to have my data, I'm out. And then the model that was not bad becomes less good. I just hadn't thought of that. And how do we try and prevent or think through that? Let me go back to one of the points.
Well, I want to touch on that for a moment. That what you're touching on is such a terrible risk that we have right now with this division that we have within the U.S. and this lack of trust. So I was fortunate enough when I had my daughter that I got to have her at the Google daycare, which was just this amazing experience. But the vaccine rate was atrocious. And it stupefied me. I could not believe that these brilliant coworkers that I worked with every single day had this terrible aversion and fear of vaccinating their children. And so we had a few outbreaks in the daycare, and it just left me in perpetual fear. This lack of trust does not necessarily correlate with a lack of education, and it doesn't necessarily correlate with political party. I would say that the Google daycare was or the Google in the Bay Area is exceedingly liberal and democratic, and what I like to call myself hippy dippy granola nut. And so this desire to have full control is ends up intersecting in all of this.
Yeah, it's really an interesting point, and I know it's linked, but a little bit different. My eldest girl works in women's reproductive health at UCSF and sees amazing people from all the tech companies voracious for more data. It helped me understand how all of these panels were assembled. So it's really interesting to me that then something that you would think is more obvious, vaccine, then takes on a different storyline. Let me come back briefly, please, because there's a point that I did want to cover. In one of your slides, you said that we can intentionally models to be less biased than humans. And I was interested in that because there's this basic premise that AI, not necessarily to this audience, but AI will somehow supersede humans. We ought to be fearful. The singularity is near. But in the example you said, the way I read it, maybe that's not a bad thing, that AI can do a better job than we can in some use cases if we can design it to be less biased than we inherently are. How do we think of society adopting or becoming comfortable with the idea that we're imperfect and maybe there's actually a better way in certain circumstances, certain use cases?
Yeah, so there have been a few use cases where I've actually blocked the launching of a feature because once I understood what the training data that were going to be used, I just became too fearful that there wouldn't be a way that we could edit or supplement that training data in order to deal with that bias. So just think back to the Amazon hiring example. 3 years they tried to fix this, and they weren't able to fix it through the training data or the model itself. And so being able to use something like Einstein Analytics, so Einstein is our AI platform, Analytics provides a lot of data visualization, and so you can see, is there great skew in the data where you have much more representation of one group than another. It can show outlier, you've got a huge segment of outliers here. And then it will also do an analysis and highlight, is there disparate impact detected in there. And so I always encourage our customers, deeply understand your data. And if you're seeing these kinds of issues of bias, skew, representativeness, you know, this large group of outliers out here, and you don't understand where are these outliers coming from, stop. Don't pass go, don't collect $200, just stop. Examine your business processes. Try to figure out where are these issues coming from. Because if you try just to plow ahead, I'm just going to lop off these outliers, I'm going to do some kind of data manipulation to deal with the skew, you're going to be constantly battling that data issue. And again, you may not actually be able to deal with the bias that's just pouring into your business. So not only is it smarter from a business perspective to fix that bias, again, come back to error. I think a lot of discussions go better when I talk about it as error, not bias. But also, it's better for society as a whole because it can highlight for us things that we might not have seen or might not have wanted to see about ourselves.
So I'm a big fan of straw poll surveys. So I'm biased. I'm technical optimist, technology optimist. I'm a believer that AI is both inevitable and important. Right? So that's my starting position. Doesn't mean that there aren't things to manage and things to consider. I'm just a believer that there's some really tough problems, and thank goodness there's some ways to assist and supplement. Logically, if we can help a radiologist view 100 images and understand where to spend his or her time differently than trying to look at all 100 equally, feels like the right thing. And we have some radiologists working with us to try and pursue that, not to replace them, to augment, to supplement. But let me just raise a hand. If you went to the doc and said, I have this issue, and the doc said, hang on a second, let me put in all this data, blah, 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 genomic data, your epigenetic data, all this data, whatever amount you feel is right. Doc presses calculate, whatever button you want to press, and says, machine says X, right? Or doc says, based on my experience, you know, I think it's X. Would you be open to a future in which AI gives you that and the doc is basically the human interface? Or would you always say, hey, you can take all that, but at the end of the day, I don't trust it. I want to work with a human. So those that see a future in which AI could be a significant last stop, not just a support, but actually final stop in some part of our healthcare, just like an ATM is the final stop for getting cash and we don't go into a DBS branch anymore. So can I ask, yes, you would be supportive or open to that? I just think it's interesting, Kathy,
Yeah.
because, you know, normally in these, thank you, normally in these things, roughly half the audience, if I say everybody that would supply data, you know, genomic data, anonymized, let's assume, let's not argue whether we can anonymize, let's assume we can reasonably anonymize. Normally half the audience says yes and half the audience says absolutely not. So I'm always curious about this sort of thing. Let's keep going on, and I'm going to go to Slido in just a second, or if you'd prefer just to raise your hand. Yes, please.
Can I give an anecdote? So Data and Society is this great research group in the US, and there's a paper that they're going to be publishing, or they're going to be presenting at FatStar at the end of the month. So FatStar is Fair, Accountable, Transparent ML. It's like the premier fairness or ethics in ML conference. And they were developing an AI that can predict sepsis in hospital patients, so blood infection. And they found that nurses wanted explainability. When the AI said, this patient is at high risk of sepsis, they're like, no, 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 tell me why you think this patient is at high risk. Whereas the doctors were like, I don't care. Like, this was developed by smart people, and just tell me who's at high risk, and I'm good with that. When they dug into it, there were a few different factors that influenced that huge difference in acceptability. One is that nurses spend so much more time with the patients. They really get to know those patients and track them. There's also tends to be hierarchy issues where doctors treat nurses as their servants. They're just told what to do. And sometimes they're told the right things, sometimes they're not. So nurses have not only become distrustful, but also they feel like they just know the patient so much better than an AI could. Whereas the doctors, they pop in for a few minutes each day, like, hey, how you doing? Your labs look great, all right. See you later. They're out the door. Like, do they know better than the AI? No. So they're going to be much more trustworthy of it. And so as AI developers, we need to think about those kinds of situations. And when we think about explainability, we also have to think about interpretability. So Einstein Discovery is our most powerful AI tool. Primarily, data scientists use it. We provide a ton of data. Confusion matrices, we show all kinds of different analyses where you can analyze the model and do different comparisons on it. Einstein Prediction Builder is our tool to democratize AI. Those users are absolutely not data scientists. We cannot talk about terms like data linkage and collinearity because they're not going to understand what the heck that means. Usability testing showed that confusion matrices are confusing for them. And so when we think about, again, how do we communicate why a model is doing what it's doing, we really have to understand who it is that's going to be on the receiving end of it and provide them that information, because having a human in the loop to make that final decision and validate, yes, this person is at high risk of sepsis, I'm going to do X, is only as good as the person who is able to understand that and is willing to trust it.
Boy, I've got three things off of what you just said, and I want to try and think them through briefly. Nurse. Is it your thinking that a nurse takes that time, doesn't matter male, female, I'm assuming these are all gender neutral, so a nurse spends more time and therefore more empathetic, deeply understanding that individual, and therefore being more informed than, in this particular case, an AI model might be, because the nurse has developed a deeper, richer set of data upon which to make a decision? Or is it that there's something less sophisticated, meaning it's just nurses want to sort of make sure they've checked things correctly? I'm trying to figure out whether there's a learning moment, which is that nurses actually have an advantage over AI because there's a level of intimacy that an AI model can never replicate. Back to this concept that AI can be amazing, it can never be empathetic. So have you had a chance, or has the research been able to unlock at all the difference between a nurse and a doctor's comfort with AI based on something that relates back to this intangibleness of relating to people?
Yeah, there are so many different issues, and gender issues being one of them as well that's in there. And so being able to measure and dissect to know, like, how much is that empathy at play? How much is it that the nurse is able to observe things about a patient that just aren't going to be documented into the health record and therefore part of the predictions? It's like you can see a change in color and of the patient's skin, and that's something that might not necessarily being included in the AI model. So these are things that are so hard. So going back to that example of what are all the different things that can impact an AI's accuracy, like, again, the brand or model of an MRI machine or an X-ray. I think, once we think for a moment that makes sense, you've got to calibrate, But when we think about the application of the AI itself, we think about X-ray. We don't think about what is the prediction or what is the model for X-ray A, B, C. Is this prediction accurate for this X-ray that I am using right now? So just the multitude of things you have to consider can be quite overwhelming and easy to make a mistake in these high-risk applications.
And I am going to go to Slido, but I'm trying to think this through quickly here. One of the things that you included in one of your writings was explainability is not the same as transparency. And there's lots of acronyms about fairness, accountability, transparency. So especially when you get into multi-layer deep neural networks, we lose the ability to say, how did that happen and why did that happen? Can you spend a moment just to share with us how you see the differences between what people refer to as transparent AI and perhaps the more tangible, more important, more easily understood concept of explainable or interpretable?
So transparency can refer to how is it that we developed this model? How did we collect the data? Is there anything that we did to the data? Google came out with, IBM has a separate paper as well, of data sheets for data sets. You can think of it as like a nutrition label for the training data. So it gives you all of the information of where was this collected from, did we do any data curation, any labeling to it, and then model cards, similar. They're nutrition labels for models. So those provide some transparency around the model itself. And then there is the explainability, so the confusion matrix, being able to show you what the accuracy or performance score is it. And then there's the interpretability, understanding these are the top 2 predictors in your model. If it's a dude with the name Jared and he played lacrosse in high school, you're good to go. Hire him immediately. That's the kind of interpretability that we're referring to.
Okay. I'm going to jump onto a couple of these, and what I'm going to do is just sort of rapid fire. You can choose how you'd like to answer them, and I'll read them pretty much as is. What is the best way to control malicious or inappropriate use of AI? Ought this to be by regulation or voluntary by individual companies?
So I think the example of deep fakes with the regulations that California have come up with are a great example of that. People who want to use deep fakes in very harmful or malicious ways, they are not going to adhere to any kind of voluntary regulation. And the risks to our democracy and society, imagine one of the examples I heard from a judge was in the justice system, where he is becoming concerned that video evidence, deepfake video evidence, if we can't tell that it's a deep fake, then at what point can he no longer trust video evidence in court? Oh my God. I mean, that's just startling to me that we could be in that kind of situation. And so in these kinds of cases, I think if we don't have regulation to stop dead in its track these really harmful applications, then we could end up down a path that is, we could never get the genie back in the bottle. So there are some things where I think voluntary is going to be fine, but there are other places that it's just too high risk for us not to regulate it.
And we're going to see that more than we may collectively wish in the months ahead with the elections upcoming in the United States and the raging debate about who can do what and post what and how long can it be up. And it's unfortunately, I think, going to be a big deal. I know you've written previously, good for companies to take this on board. The creators of the tech need to be the first line of defense with government and the regulatory environment there to make sure people play by the rules, but that the creators have to take that responsibility. Next question. When software companies claim to fix bias in their system, this individual writes, I'm concerned that they simply have imposed their own definition of fairness, because in theory there is no world objective of fairness. So therefore, how do we think of this issue that companies assure us they've fixed any bias?
Yeah, I mean, so Salesforce is a platform. We don't own our customers' data, and we often can't see their data. 80% of the fields in a customer's org are customized fields. They don't come out of box. A particular field could be called foo. We have no idea what that thing is. It could be a sensitive field like age, race, or gender. We can't see it. And so it makes it very difficult for us to understand what customers are doing. And of course, there are all kinds of regulations when you're a cloud provider about what you could see in the customer's data or how they're using their models. So we try to provide the tools for them to do the right thing, try to put mitigation strategies in place to make it easy to do the right thing and hard to do the wrong thing. One of the things that we are currently developing right now in Prediction Builder is a way to help them understand different definitions of fairness. So if we just think about the very simple example of type 1 and type 2 error in statistics, it basically is false positive and false negative. If you are a bank, you are going to want as little risk as possible, even if that means denying the other person a loan when they actually can pay it back. If you're wanting to get that loan, of course, you want it the exact other way around. So with these 21 plus different definitions of fairness, how do we help companies figure out which one they should be using? And then there should be transparency. So, for example, the Apple credit card, you may have seen in the news, Goldman Sachs has sworn up and down they do not use gender in their model. It's illegal. It's financial services. You can't make those kinds of decisions based on gender. But there are obviously proxy variables at work. So even though they're not explicitly using gender, there are other variables that represent gender. And so them simply saying over and over again, we're not using gender, not good enough. There's obviously harm that's being placed there. And so there needs to be, again, like the model cards for them to explain how is this model working. And part of that would be defining that fairness.
So I guess on the basis that it is semantically correct to say I'm not using gender, I'm not looking at a category that says male, female, I'm getting to an outcome that's roughly equivalent through other means, but I'm being truthful when I say I'm not using gender. So this sort of nuance is important. Is it logical then that customers will vote with their money in the same way that now you'd say, gee, I don't want to buy from a sweatshop. I don't want to buy from somebody that has, kids in a country stitching together clothing. So is the idea that society will come to learn whether AI has been used wrongly, sort of a whistleblower concept? How do we get to this sort of truth where it may be wrongly used? Because there's nobody sort of monitoring it. How does that future look?
Yeah, so I think all of us have a responsibility to educate society about what they should be expecting of their providers. We should have an expectation for how we want our data to be handled. How many of you have had your data leaked through a malicious hack? Have you gotten like a notification that your data has been lost?
Wow, I'm amazed at that
shocked.
few hands. I would have thought every single person in the room would have raised their hands.
That was exactly what I was expecting. Oh my God, maybe you guys are just like awesome
only
in Singapore.
One? If you said how many have had hacked through 4 or 5 different vendors, I'm still going to hold my hand in the air.
Yes, me too. Yes. Oh my God, you guys got it going on here. Okay, this is where I need to move then. So I know every time I get a notice that my data has been hacked, I'm like, see ya, and I close my account and I do whatever I can. I'm not going to interact with that business anymore because it is just shameful and unacceptable in this day and age that there isn't true data security to protect data. And so very early on, one of our very first Einstein features that came out, it was purchased by, or there was a desire for an insurance company to purchase it. And they were getting ready to sign it. And their compliance, like the corporate ethics and compliance and legal team, they reviewed the contract and they rejected. They said, no, we can't purchase this because at that time we didn't have model explainability. And so they said the legal risk is too high. If we get sued because someone believes that the AI is making an unfair prediction against them, then we can't defend this in court. And so this was something that we had to it was certainly on the roadmap, but there are features that it takes time to develop. And so it took developing that model transparency. And so we're going to see more and more companies that are going to become sophisticated purchasers of AI, and ethical features, bias checking features, model explainability and interpretability, having robust model cards and data sheets, all of these things are going to become table stakes. And so right now they're ethical differentiators, but at some point they're going to become table stakes that if you don't have them, then companies are not going to buy it.
Another question for you, and I won't try and ask you to name anything specific, but generally, are there industries that you feel are more mature in applying AI in an ethical and responsible way? And conversely, are there industries that you feel are very much a laggard in doing so, or perhaps applying it in not ethical and responsible ways? So no company names, but just industries largely that you think are mature in applying AI in an ethical way. Industries that you feel are lighthouses for others to take reference.
Well, I think some of the more harmful examples we see tend to come out of social media, because there's just so much information that is there. There's so much potential to do harmful things with that data. There are some industries that are understandably very reticent to adopt AI, and so those tend to be the regulated industries like financial services, because there are concerns since the law isn't quite there. They're not exactly sure how they might defend it if there are questions that come up. There isn't an industry that jumps to my mind immediately as being a beacon, like this particular industry is doing a great job of implementing AI. It tends to be, I think, individual companies that I think are really standing out as trying to do more. And it's important to acknowledge that with a lot of the issues that have come out with dark design patterns, this addictive technology, these privacy and consent agreements that it takes days to read and a legal degree to understand, it took a couple of decades for us to get to where we are. It was this boiling of the frog. Are you guys familiar with the boiling frog? It's where it's not actually true, but it's a myth that if you put a frog in a pot of water, room temperature pot of water, and then you slowly raise the temperature, the frog adjusts to the temperature until it's boiling, and then the frog is dead. So there were these steps that gradually over a couple of decades took for us to get to where we are today. And many companies have recognized we're not in a good place. We can't continue this race to the bottom, but we also can't fix it overnight. So a lot of the criticism of people in roles like mine that we're just ethics washing for our customers, or we're just for our companies, or we're just virtue signaling, that this isn't genuine. It really kind of guts me when I hear that, because I know so many of the people working in these roles, and we all care deeply about trying to resolve these issues. But the problem is we can't fix a problem that took 2 decades to make in just a year. Many of these are very complex problems that, again, have resulted from historical bias or other processes in place. And so how do we solve these together? High tide rises all boats. How can we work together in ways that a lot of companies have not done before?
Yeah, so I'll expose another bias. I become cranky on things like this sometimes and have said in various forums privacy is overrated, because we've all given away huge amounts of data knowingly or unknowingly in exchange for convenience. And so my basic rage on this one is it's hard for us to improve meaningful human level issues around medical care because data has been cranked down so much for various reasons that we know. And at the same time, there's a plethora of data if we want to have food delivered slightly more quickly. And so I think this asymmetry of convenience versus human importance. So when people say privacy is important, I always say, okay, what have you done on that recently? So I take your point. I think it's a tough conversation for us to have, an important conversation for us, because if we really wanted to be authentic in this as society, the answer is, here's what I'm willing to do and here's what I'm not, and I understand these are the pros and these are the cons. So let me bridge into a question on that. These are complicated issues that don't have necessarily an absolute right or wrong. They're sort of on a scale. Do we need a group of wise individuals to try and help us through this collectively, or is this something where sort of every man, woman, and child, casts a vote? And how do we think of this? Not so much opt-in, opt-out, but deeply, is AI a critical part of healthcare, and therefore insurance, deal with it, legislation, deal with it, versus so many countries are stranded. Yeah. Do I love AI? Do I hate AI? So I come back, is there sort of a council of elders that helps societies think about this? How do you look at this? That's part of the work you're doing with this sort of group of companies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we need people like Joy Balawame, who did that first seminal study. People had done it before, but she was just so out there with her AI Ain't I a Woman and this gender shade study and creating the Algorithmic Justice League. I remember very early on hearing people just guffaw at the idea that technology is not neutral. Are you kidding me? Like, how could a machine be biased? That's just the most ridiculous thing. A pair of scissors is biased. My brother is left-handed. He can't pick up a pair of random scissors laying around. He carries a pocket knife in his pocket because scissors are designed for people that are right-handed. That's biased. So, like, if a pair of scissors can be biased, surely an algorithm can. And so we need people in these roles to educate society to think differently. My daughter, for example, I don't let her, she's 13, I don't let her have any social media. I disabled Siri on her phone. I do not post her, the only time I've posted her picture on social media is from the back of her head at a distance. I don't include her name or any other identifying details. She is not on the grid. When she is an adult and she can control, she has the ability to control her information, she can choose how she wants to give that away. And she is miserable. Oh God, she hates it. About it constantly. All the other Insta girls that are in her class, she doesn't know what they're talking about. And I'm like, okay. Sucks to be you, but that's the way it is, because Facebook ain't getting you data. So this is something that, we as a generation, we need to start training the generation below us and help them do the right thing when they don't know, because there are plenty of companies that are going to swoop in and take advantage of their naivety, as we all were. We had no idea many of these times when we were this boiling frog giving away little bits and pieces of our data for convenience.
What's interesting is there's a school of thought, and I can't remember who said it, so I can't attribute it, but this concept that society, humanity moves forward collectively based on our ability to forget. As in, we did things, we're embarrassed, ashamed, wish we hadn't, but the good news is we sort of plow ahead. And certainly if you look at my university era pictures versus now, I'm thankful that there wasn't a lot of social media. The answer is I have lots of images and I can sort of keep them in the shoebox and say, well, that was a different time. But now you don't have that luxury, right? So when you apply for a job or you apply to a university, everything that you've done, everything you've ever posted, to your point. But let me take this one step further. That's how you and your daughter work it out. But her friends that take pics and tag and say, here I am with, Susie at this event. So we can have our own choices, but back to this concept, there's a lot of things that we don't have the ability to choose. And so now there is information out there, and how do we deal with that? I'm not asking so much, but I'm thinking out loud. I'm sensitive to the time. I do want to come back. One of the questions that I always wrestle with, and I'm going to pose it for you, when we think about countries that are more willing to use data assertively, will it be inevitable that they will advance more quickly because AI is an iterating learning model? Will they advance in AI and therefore take the lead, keep the lead, extend the lead because they're more assertive or more liberal in their use of data? And if so, what does that mean for other countries? We'll get this increasing asymmetry. Inevitably, China is much more comfortable in using data. Does that mean China is the today, tomorrow, inevitable winner in AI?
Yeah, so I think I frequently hear the "but China" argument for different things, whether it's facial recognition or weaponization of AI as kind of a justification of, well, we got to do it too because they're doing it. And again, you get into this mindset of a race to the bottom. That's how all of these different companies justify changing their terms of service, changing their privacy policies, changing how they're collecting and using information. And we've seen where we've gotten just from private companies doing this. If entire nations get into this nuclear war of how they want to use AI, then you can imagine just how much worse it can be. And so I put back to the individuals of, so what if China's AI facial recognition is dramatically more accurate than it is in the US? Okay, but we can't do things like there's a company I won't name that wanted to increase the representativeness of the training database for their facial recognition. So they went to Atlanta, which has a high population of African Americans, and gave African American homeless people a $5 gift card in order to scan their face. That kind of extractive nature, their intentions may have been good. We want to be more representative, but they did it in a harmful, extractive manner. We can't use how another company or country is acting to justify, not standing true to our own values or violating human rights in the process.
Yeah, for all the parents in the room, when your kids say, Susie can stay out till midnight, why can't I? And the answer is, I'm not Susie's father. Exactly. So it doesn't, I'm not measured based on that. Briefly, your healthcare example showed the genetic, gender, and race difference. Genetic, gender, and race difference. How do you reconcile the need to account for differences,
yes,
but try to not be discriminatory? And if I can slightly add on to that, this concept that bias, I would argue, is not inherently preventable. And you want to positively
yes,
not loan money to someone that's never paid it back, so that's reasonable.
Yep.
So how do we strike this balance of need to account for good decision making using bias in that sense, yes, while recognizing that there are things we don't want to include? So I know it's kind of an open-ended question, but this concept of finding that balance. Is it more data? The models are generally okay. If we only had 10,000 more, 100,000 more, 1 million more, your example about Atlanta, how do we, quote, tackle this?
Yeah, so I think we have to acknowledge the dearth of data that we have for certain groups and figure out, is it okay for a company to use an AI that's going to be super accurate and super helpful for one segment of the population and be transparent, okay, because you are this gender, this race, this is going to be a very accurate prediction, but all the rest of you, I'm sorry, we can't use the AI for this because you obviously don't want to try it and apply it to another group where the recommendations are going to be wrong and harmful. But is it okay for one segment of the population to benefit from the technology, knowing that another segment of the population is not going to benefit? Should we have, if not regulations, at least internal policies or rules that say, look, we're not going to release this until it's representative for everyone, that everyone can benefit equally? And we have to think about models of how do we get more access to more data. In the healthcare example in the US, it's super hard. The companies that are creating this healthcare AI, they can't provide healthcare to the entire population of individuals that can't afford it. So how do we get that data? This is something that I come back to the government, that this is a question that the government should be asking. If this is a great thing for society, then how can government help give resources to make this more representative for all, so you don't have to go and collect data in an extractive way from that population? There's been discussions, and I think there was it wasn't Ancestry.com or 23andMe, but it was a different genetic testing company that, in order to increase the data from populations that they were missing, they would give their analysis away for free to people in those populations. That sounds like a great thing. But then we start getting into the question of, is it okay that if you are affluent and you can pay for it, you get privacy, but if you are poor or you're from a population that is not well represented, then you have to exchange your data for these services? So these are really hard moral and ethical questions that there isn't a straightforward answer to. But we have to be able to have conversations, and I think too often they're heated, they're very pointed conversations that put each group on the defensive, and it makes it very difficult to try and come up with a policy, even if it's not one everyone is comfortable with. It's one that we've discussed civilly as a society and decided this is the way forward. So far, it's just been like, yeah, we can't agree, so we're just not going to continue the conversation.
We're at the end. I know there's other questions on Slido, so I beg your forgiveness, but we're at the time that we'd promised and a little bit more, and so I wanted to start by just making sure that we had time to also continue the dialogue in more of our networking session. I think what we can agree on for sure is that all of us as people are biased. We're all biased engines, and we're a product of our training and learning and experience, just like AI is. It's a product of its training and learning and experience. And we just need to find ways to be honest about that and to confront it and deal with it. But it won't get better by saying, once AI is non-biased, then we can really be excited about it. It's going to be a tough journey and a long journey and requires engagement. So please join me in thanking Kathy for sharing her perspectives. Thank you, Kathy. And so, like everything, all these things are a matter of hanging out and chatting some more. So I think AI, inevitable. I think it's going to be important for us, but we have to continue to talk about it. And part of that starts with this, which is let's spend some time together. And so thanks for coming over and being part of what we're doing. And if you have topics or suggestions, please send them to me. I'm steve@sginnovate.com. I'm very transparent, and I'm also explainable, not too interpretable. But thank you for coming over tonight. Thanks, Kathy.